We have some really disturbing new information out of Israel. The Israeli Prime Minister's spokesman just confirmed babies and toddlers were found with their heads decapitated in Kfar Aza in southern Israel after Hamas attacks in the kibbutz over the weekend. That has been confirmed by the Prime Minister's office. Let us go now to CNN's Hadass Gold in Jerusalem. This news is beyond devastating, and for the families listening, for the people of Israel, for anyone that is a parent who loves children. I don't know how they get through this, but this kind of thing and the way that this has happened has really changed any possibility of a relationship, a peace accord between Israel and Gaza.
Hello, dear listeners, friends, comrades, subjects, citizens, insurgents, fugitives, defectors, dissidents, even the haters and losers. Welcome to Turbulence. My name is Dylan Saba, and I'm here with my co-host Seamus Malekafseli, along with our producer Em Siniza. We're recording from New York City, the center of a world empire that is dying, but so far from dead. Seamus, I think I was telling you about this in a different context, but recently I read this book about World War II, and more specifically about the Holocaust. It's called Why Did the Heavens Not Darken by Arno Mayer. It's a really excellent book, and what it does is it aims to give historical context to what he calls the Judeocide, situating it within the broader 30 years crisis that stretched from the First World War to the Second World War. And he compares that period to both the 30 Years' War in Europe in the 17th century and also to the First Crusade in the 11th century. But what really stood out for me, and I take this to be one of the book's central interventions, was that the Nazis, and Hitler in particular, were completely obsessed with and terrified by Bolshevism. And it was that fear that gave rise to and ultimately structured the final solution in which millions of Eastern European Jews were systematically exterminated. Now, that was striking to me because it's not really the traditional historicization of the Holocaust, where Hitler's campaign against the Soviet Union is treated as a practical matter, kind of secondary to the driving ideological force of anti-Semitism. I'm bringing this up because what it made me think of was the experience of watching what was very nakedly a genocidal military campaign, and really continues to be a nakedly genocidal military campaign by the Israeli forces in Gaza in the period since October 2023. In particular, I'm thinking about those first couple of months when basically the entire mainstream media spoke in what was essentially a unified voice in saying that what Israel was doing and what the US was arming and funding was not a genocide, because the Israelis were waging war against Hamas and its radical ideology. And ultimately, it didn't matter how many buildings they blew up, how many civilians they massacred. The target was terrorism. And therefore, basically, anything goes. Very simply, it felt like we were watching the justification of a genocide in real time.
Something that comes up a lot in talking about the Holocaust and the justification for it is, of course, Nazi propaganda. But less discussed is how that was propagated not just through Goebbels and directly from the propaganda ministry, but also through newspapers and radio stations in Germany that supported the war effort and the obscene racism that justified it, running the gamut from Das Reich to Der Stürmer.
And that role was famously acknowledged by the Nuremberg Tribunal when the Der Stürmer editor Julius Streicher was convicted on the crime of incitement to genocide for his work and put to death by hanging. And really, he was considered as responsible as those who pulled the trigger on countless innocent Jews on the Eastern Front.
Just as well, Germany's rise was enabled in part by Western media organizations who were very well enamored with Hitler and the ideology he was bringing to Germany, more than willing to whitewash something deeply evil on the horizon if they believed it was in line with Western values. This has been in the DNA of the Western media for a very long time, and even acknowledging the terrors and the horrors of the Holocaust does not automatically entail lessons being learned, as we heard in our Nakba episode with Salman Abu Sitta, who said that Jewish settlers who came to Palestine just after the persecution in Germany also helped put Arabs in labor camps only a couple of years later. Unfortunately, we are back in this situation again, in which the Western media, and the American media in particular, has helped sell another genocide to the public. And we are living in the ramifications of that bitter decision-making by officials and editors alike.
So today, we are quite lucky to be joined by one of the best and most voracious critics of the Western media, and that is Adam Johnson. Adam Johnson is the co-host of the Citations Needed podcast and the author of the new book, How to Sell a Genocide, The Media's Complicity in the Destruction of Gaza, which is now out from Pluto Press. And I really highly recommend that you go out and buy that book, in part because it's an excellent book, as you'll hear in the interview that follows, but also because 100% of the proceeds from those sales is being donated to the Middle East Children's Alliance, Mecca, which is a really great organization. And I have to say something about Adam, which I should have told him, but I think I was telling M recently, and I will tell him at some point if he doesn't listen to this episode, which is that when I first got on Twitter, this was probably like 2018 or so. I was late to the game, but I opened up a whole new world. And I was like, oh, okay, this is interesting. There's all of these people with left-wing politics. People are talking about socialism and all of this stuff. That's fascinating.
That was big back then.
That was big back then. But I was like, people don't really seem to understand what's going on with foreign policy. This is a big kind of blind spots around imperialism and what the U.S. is doing abroad. And I was like, except this like one white guy named Adam Johnson. And I was just like so surprised, not to profile or whatever, that like the one guy who seemed to have the most kind of like worldly takes, at least that I encountered off the bat, was a white guy by the name of Adam Johnson. But now we put some respect on his name.
No, I too have been following Adam Johnson since my earliest days on Twitter. Always been incredibly, I don't know if intrepid is the right word. He is always dogged. That's better. Just on everybody's ass about everything. Doesn't let anyone get a word in edgewise. Great to have him in the studio, which totally exists for this podcast. I think this was a really great conversation. I say that about everything, but like it really was this time.
Yeah, Adam is excellent, and the media is better served by having a public critic like him on its ass.
Absolutely. Before we get into the conversation, we do have a pitch to you, the listener. Turbulence is entirely listener-funded. We don't run ads. We don't take money from institutions. And that independence is the foundation of this project. It only exists because of you.
Because we're committed to providing you the in-depth history and present context you need to make sense of each of these topics, these episodes take a great deal of time and effort to produce, from conception to research to editing. It's because we value your time as a listener, and because we want to produce something lasting and useful, that we think this level of effort is worth investing in. But that means we can't quite move as nimbly as we might otherwise like. So in addition to our free public episodes, we're also dropping weekly episodes behind the paywall. That's where we'll be able to respond to events as they unfold in closer to real time, providing our analysis, following up on threads and conversations from prior episodes, and drawing connections across the topics we've covered.
To do all this, we need your support. A $5 monthly subscription will give you access to the bonus feed, our Substack community, and most importantly, you'll make it possible for us to keep doing this work independently week after week. Subscribe today at turbulencepod.substack.com and follow along on Twitter and Instagram at turbulence_pod. We hope you'll join us. We are speaking this afternoon with Adam Johnson. He is the co-host of Citations Needed with Nima Shirazi, and he is, of course, the author of the recent book, How to Sell a Genocide, the Media's Complicity in the Destruction of Gaza. Adam, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me on.
So when I think about the nature of the attacks October the 7th, hundreds of Hamas fighters blasting through the barriers surrounding the Strip, taking hundreds of hostages. When the accusations started going around of these truly gigantic atrocities that Hamas was being accused of, not only these atrocities, but that they were ISIS-like, that they were literally in league with the Islamic State as an organization. One, what were the specific dimensions of these accusations for those who may not remember those details? And two, why did Hamas need to be accused of all of these myriad things that it simply did not do in the course of the beginning of Al-Aqsa flood?
Well, because clearly if one's goal is to commit genocide, which I think very quickly it was, and obviously it was building off pre-existing designs. You could look at any so-called right-wing think tank in Israel from 2018 or 2015, and there were plans to empty Gaza. The formal plans always involved, quote unquote, voluntary resettlement to Jordan or to, Gulf countries or wherever. It didn't matter as long as they weren't in what they viewed as greater Israel or Israel as such. That there was a decision made and that the obvious counter to that decision was going to be calls for a ceasefire because there had been a playbook for this before. This is why Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch and Doctors Without Borders and Oxfam all called for a ceasefire within days because everyone knew that there was a formula, in a sense, for these kind of mowing the grass bombing campaigns that Israel had done prior, whether it be 2021, 2014, 2012, 2009, Cast-led. So Israel and its supporters in the United States, specifically the Biden White House, very quickly, because if you recall, Tony Blinken initially called for a ceasefire on Twitter and then immediately deleted the tweet a couple hours later because this was pro forma. This was everybody knows there's no political solution or military solution of so-called defeating Hamas. And so when you need to eliminate calls for a ceasefire from the realm of capital S seriousness, the first thing you do is you have to paint the party with which one would have a ceasefire as ontologically and cartoonishly evil, and therefore making calls for a ceasefire out of the realm of seriousness. And this was done immediately, of course, with, again, these kind of the atrocity propaganda, much of which was debunked and eventually debunked even in right-wing media about, of course, beheaded babies. That ended up not being true. Initially, it was 40 beheaded babies to kind of give it a biblical round number. And then initially, it was kind of just babies. And then they were like, there may have been a beheading. And then it kind of just went away, or people walked back or deleted tweets to that effect. That was on October 11th to about October 14th, October 15th. And then, of course, you had babies in ovens, cutting out babies out of pregnant women. This is sort of the most visceral, gruesome, and horrific things one can think of, because then you're on the defensive and you're saying, well, that, there's no evidence of that. And then if you say that publicly and you're a journalist, you get harassed and doxxed by these kind of vigilante Zionist groups. And the reason, especially in the first few weeks, that was so important is because if they are this kind of ISIS-like entity, then it doesn't make sense to have a ceasefire with them. Of course, never mind the fact that ISIS was largely a foreign-backed mercenary organization without any indigenous support in the places it took over. Whereas, of course, Hamas they are Palestinian. They're from Gaza. Obviously, their leadership is largely comprised of people whose parents or grandparents had either been displaced or killed by Israel. And they couldn't have any secular or political motivations. Everything had to be the result of mindless jihadist bloodlust or anti-Semitism, right? They sort of happened to have this, what Joe Biden calls ancient hatred, which is really bad luck because they happen to have been the sort of ostensibly Jewish state that had colonized and removed them from their land, right? Out of all the gin joints in all the towns, they happen to have that particular form of racism. And then once it was removed from the realm of capital S seriousness, then the debate was how to eliminate Hamas, quote unquote. And the debate was like, how do we do that while reducing civilian casualties such as it was? And so you had, so-called progressives in Congress from Ro Khanna to Elizabeth Warren and obviously infamously Bernie Sanders not embracing a ceasefire and in fact supporting the ostensible military aim of eliminating Hamas, but doing so supposedly appealing to some like boutique artisanal bombing campaign that was going to do so while like so-called reducing civilian casualties. And this in the first few months was how the ideological debate was narrowed down to not, does this make any sense? Does Israel have any so-called right to defeat Hamas? What does that even mean in context? It was how to do this otherwise noble and seemingly anodyne military aim of destroying Hamas, this kind of ISIS-like entity, It was how many Palestinians deserve to die to do that. And that really was the realm of debate, again, cemented by people like Bernie Sanders, who went on CBS and CNN in November and December, as late as December of 2023, and said, and I quote, "I don't know how you have a ceasefire with a group like Hamas who seeks the destruction of Israel," unquote, unlike, of course, Israel, which doesn't apparently seek the destruction of Palestine and Palestinians. And then, of course, this was affirmed and propped up by Matt Duss of CIP on Democracy Now! And so that was sort of viewed as the far left flank of acceptable discourse until around February and March, when I think the nihilistic violence became completely indefensible. And then it suddenly supporting a ceasefire, and we can talk about how the White House redefined the term to mean something completely different, but at least in principle, supporting a ceasefire went from a fringe far left position to the obvious liberal position with, again, a new definition of ceasefire offered by the White House, which we can get into. And so that few weeks, that few months is really the main focus of the book. It covers from October of 2023 to October 2024, but I'd say the primary, what I call high leverage, or where we could have intervened to stop the genocide, mostly took place in the first few weeks, first 3 to 6 months, really. And that's why that's the focus of the book, is critical decisions were made by very influential, very powerful media and political figures who decided that they were not going to challenge these premises. And there's an opening, I guess, narrative about what happened on MSNBC on the morning of October 7th, where you have Ali Valshi, who's running the anchor desk, and he brings in Ayman Mohyeddin, who had lived in Gaza and had reported from there during 2014. And they start before this becomes indexed as 9/11 times 1,000, they start providing context. They start saying, here's why they would break out of Gaza. Here's the political causes and antecedents of this. And all hell breaks loose. We talked to several sources at MSNBC, and this was also confirmed by the New York Times about a year ago, that this was the first and last time Comcast corporate had ever intervened directly in MSNBC coverage.
Wow.
They brought in Rashida Jones and Condé Nast, the head of MSNBC and NBC News, respectively, and basically said, never do this again. And then they brought in Martin Fletcher, who was a longtime Middle East correspondent for NBC News, who had family who were actually casualties on October 7th, and he himself had served in the IDF. They went on an MSNBC and NBC News-wide conference call where he led the kind of quick education program about the so-called history of Israel. He said that the Jews are the real Palestinians, that Palestine didn't exist until 1967, and Palestinians aren't real. He sort of gave every Zionist propaganda line under the sun. And then from here forth, they were told by management that if you had a question about Gaza, you talk to him. So very, very early on, context was viewed as terrorism apologia, and that Hamas had to be indexed as ontologically evil with no political causes or motivations. And then that is reflected in the coverage. It's reflected in how this was reported on. Now, that eventually kind of loosened up as the genocide went on and became, again, more and more indefensible. But those early critical first few months, that was the acceptable range of discourse on cable news specifically, but also, of course, the New York Times, Washington Post, and others.
I mean, this is a bit theoretical and hypothetical, but there were attempts by the IDF, their public relations division, Avichai Adrai, their Arabic spokesman, made some attempts to also make the Houthis into these ISIS-like entities, Hezbollah into an ISIS-like entity.
Everybody's ISIS, because they needed a kind of cartoon Islamophobic cliche that Americans could internalize. The Israeli government spent millions of dollars pushing the hashtag Hamas is ISIS. It was repeated by everybody from Emmanuel Macron to Lloyd Austin to Joe Biden. They spent a lot of money and effort. And obviously, there's all these parallel nonprofits who we can't keep track of really, who also pushed it on social media. Because again, they needed something that was the American public could easily digest and internalize. And that's why the beheaded babies hoax was so central, because it played into very specific visceral Islamophobic tropes. And they knew that they could never produce evidence, but it didn't matter because once the story was walked back, it had already served its primary function.
Yeah, you've really touched on something quite important, I think, which is the question of, why you titled your book, How to Sell a Genocide, and the debate over when the genocide started, if it was a genocide from the beginning versus at some point in the war when the slaughter crossed a certain kind of threshold and it became intolerable. And that switch in the logic, I think, is really critical between treating the Palestinians as a demographic problem to solve with violence, sure, but in a slower process of removal, ethnic cleansing, to be managed in these flare-ups, quote unquote, flare-ups of violence, these cyclical wars that all happen on Israel's terms, initiated by Israel and then ultimately ended by Israel when they agree to a ceasefire. And I think what was different about this was that this was a round, a quote unquote round, that came from Palestinian initiative itself. And it started with a huge military setback from Israel. And so that became intolerable. And it really was at that moment of military setback that the logic switched to one of raw, outright elimination. And I think that was reflected in the discourse from the very, very beginning and became a critical element in the justification, such that they could make a claim to self-defense when they were engaging in that very kind of eliminationist military strategy from those first hours even.
What really made people feel crazy was what they were saying was openly genocidal, right?
Yeah.
You had Gallant's human animals comment. You had President Herzog talking about there's no innocents in Gaza. You obviously had Netanyahu's Amlach speech, which is a very clearly genocidal reference. Although Yair Rosenberg bent over backwards to insist it was actually the non-genocidal reference to Amlach from a different book. Okay, well, that seems unlikely. And so you had these openly genocidal comments where they very clearly talked about their goals, and especially in Hebrew and Hebrew media, they're very explicit about their goals. But then once that gets through the kind of liberal Zionist laundromat in American media, it comes out as a kind of zero dark 30. I mean, you had Washington Post running a headline saying "Hunt for Hamas," like they were sort of going through clinically and looking for like the whole population to them is Hamas. They're an undifferentiated, Muslim horde. They don't care. And so when people talk about, well, when was it a genocide? It seems like very clear to me that, I don't know, on October 9th, when they started saying they're human animals and they're going to kill them all and starve them and cut off their food and water, I would say probably then. And obviously Zionism has genocide built into its logic, which of course is obvious to anyone who's been displaced or killed prior to October 7th. But yeah, this idea that there was going to be this, and again, so-called progressives in Congress kept appealing to this surgical kind of zero dark 30-esque war on Hamas. It was always absurd because there's no constituency for that. Yeah. Even if you sort of bought into that premise, especially when they say like they pretty much consider everybody to be Hamas. Like their criteria is effectively, if you are not completely submissive to Zionist and American security architecture, you're seen as quote unquote Hamas. Or if you're one of these, the irony of course is that they ended up funding ISIS-linked gangs to steal aid and to be the attack dogs of the U.S. and Israel. So this is, again, one of the reasons why Hamas has always cracked down on ISIS, because they view them as being a proxy for Gulf or Zionist interest.
Yeah, just to put a finer point even on the genocide framework and how that was used even to obfuscate what was happening. Because, you mentioned the human animals statement from Galan and other genocidal rhetoric. There seemed to be this division between the two elements of genocide, right? So it's like genocide on the ground in terms of actually committing the war crimes, the targeting of civilians, and then the genocide in intent of having the requisite intent. And one thing that I saw both through the media and just popular discourse is a complete division between those. So the genocidal rhetoric, there was a kind of like emotional sympathy for Israelis as victims. To say like, well, okay, yes, they're saying things that are, distasteful, but they were just attacked. How would you feel? This is 1,000 9/11s, whatever. And it's taken in isolation as being disconnected from what's happening on the ground. And then what's happening on the ground is given the same kind of deference and tactical smokescreen that we are used to with U.S. empire and U.S. militarism, which is to say, well, they actually had a target. Maybe it was AI generated or...
Right. As long as there was a thin military aim, you could pretty much kill hundreds of people a day.
And for us, like as people watching this, not just as Palestinians, but as normal people of conscience, when you see that intent expressed and you see the reality of the destruction on the ground, it is the most obvious thing in the world to put those two together and say, well, they're saying that they want to commit genocide and they are committing in practice what is genocidal. So I think that might be what's happening. But part of what I like about what you've done in the book is to take that kind of sense impression and really quantify it. And like in particular, through the use of language. And I think this is pretty familiar to people who have been following Palestine, advocates for the Palestinian cause for a while. It's almost a trope. The idea that the media uses the passive voice to talk about Palestinians in headlines. So Palestinians are killed, died, perished, etc., without actually naming who is doing the killing. But I think what we saw and what you demonstrate in your book is that through the genocide, this extends more categorically to entire categories of who has access to innocence and who has access to claims on law through very particular language. And like one thing that I noticed from the jump is October 7th happens. The initial death toll is listed as 1,400 people. That's eventually revised downward. But in newspapers, like not just in like kind of casual speech, in newspapers even, I saw this as 1,400 innocent civilians.
Yeah, of course.
When we know that hundreds of the people who were killed were security personnel, police, military, and it also extended to the quote unquote hostages, right? Like the term hostage for the entire duration was categorically used to refer to every single person who was taken captive and brought back to Gaza.
Right. Never prisoner of war, right?
Many were prisoners of war. And in fact, for the whole the whole second cycle of the, prisoner release negotiations, all of the civilians had long been gone. There were only prisoners of war left. And yet that language still permeated and shaped our concept of innocence.
It really peaks with the Orwellian phrase "kidnapped from a tank,"
right.
Which I thought was when we reached. Never has that phrase been uttered in the human language. Yeah, so you have this idea of the asymmetry of empathy, and we go through and we study the use of emotive terms, as you note. So Israelis are massacred, they're slaughtered brutally, horrifically, savagely, whereas Palestinians have died or are killed passively and sort of in anodyne and medical terms. And this is reflected in the language that's used. So, for example, the New York Times in the first 100 days of our study says that Israelis were massacred 124 times, Palestinians 0. They say Israelis were slaughtered 53 times, Palestinians 0. Keep in mind that the Palestinian death count at this point is 5-6x that of Israel. Actually, no, it would have been about 7 or 8 times by this point. Washington Post is 50-0 for massacre, 25-0 for slaughter. AP is 80-0 for massacre, 18 for slaughter, and so on and so forth. This is also reflected in cable news quite profoundly, even more so. CNN says Israelis were massacred 225 times in the first 100 days, whereas Palestinians only get that descriptor 16 times. CNN says they were slaughtered 79 versus 2, and so on and so forth. You get the general idea. And of course, when presented with this evidence, as I did, I emailed the New York Times and asked them about this, as had Al Jazeera had done this for a previous work on this from January of 2024. And also the Breach Media in Canada had presented similar data to the CBC, and they all give basically the same answer, which is that it's different because it's different. Well, why is it different? It just sort of has to be. They don't actually have a reason. It's just a chauvinist or racist tautology that it is assumed as an axiom that Palestinians only kill for jihadist bloodlust and for the lulz and for the sport of it, whereas Israelis, again, no matter how many people they kill, can only do so with a very heavy heart and reluctantly pursuing some noble military aim. And you'd ask them, you'd say, well, Israel killed 20,000 people, 20,000 children, numbers probably double that, in a matter of 2 years. How can you kill 20,000 children and never once commit a massacre or a slaughter? That seems statistically impossible. And they don't have an answer for it. And the reason they don't have an answer for it is because it simply has to be. Now, the real answer is that structurally, institutionally, Palestinians aren't seen as human, whereas Israelis, of course, are Western coded and seen as civilized. And the term civilization is thrown around, right? So you have words like barbaric and savage that are used over and over and over again on cable news. And these are obviously racially coded words with their history and Victorian distinctions of civilization, right? You have the kind of trifold. You have civilization, then you have the barbarian, then you have the savage. And nothing Israel does ever in any publication, AP, Washington Post, New York Times, CNN, nothing Israel ever does is said to be barbaric or savage. Only things Palestinians are doing. And so that to me seems like a fairly obviously racially coded line. And then from that point, when you establish the asymmetry in humanity, then you can have a conversation about the media's coverage of the genocide, because everything follows from those premises. And that's one way of teasing it out. And there's several others. Like you said, there's by definition, Israelis are hostages. By definition, Palestinians are prisoners. By definition, Palestinians are minors. By definition, Israelis are children. And they'll even do it in the same sentence. We identify 24 examples of when, in the same sentence, as part of the November 2023 captive exchange, they will say, in exchange for Israeli children, Israel is handing over Palestinian minors in these prisons. And over and over and over again, this asymmetry in language is clearly quantifiable and clear as day. And no one who uses it structurally, none of the editors have any reason to justify that other than mindless racism and chauvinism.
I mean, we're talking about this asymmetry of language, about words that are not able to be used for Palestinians. But I wanted to talk more about something that you've touched on here, about the inability for Palestinians to be seen as victims in any form, in any way, historically or in the present day. I mean, you bring up the ICJ case in the book that occurs in early 2024. And I remember at that time feeling the earth almost move in an attempt to discredit one of the primary sources of information, in that case of UNRWA. And I was wondering if you could go into some detail about how that discrediting came about from both the Israeli government and the American media, and why this specific organization needed to be, I mean, not just discredited, but
disbanded and defunded.
Disbanded, consent manufactured for it to be wiped off the face of the earth.
So again, if I'm wanting to commit a genocide in Gaza, you first and foremost, you have to get rid of UNRWA, because they have ideological reasons, because they maintain the refugee status of those in Gaza, because they are refugees. And Israel's plan is to sort of just run out the clock and say, sorry, you lost. It's time for you're frustrated Jordanians, go somewhere else. But then as a matter of course, you can't, if people have food, medicine, shelter, and aid, they're much more difficult to genocide. They're much more difficult to ethnically cleanse off the land. And so the first thing you have to do is delegitimize UNRWA, which they have been working on for years. But then by sheer coincidence, right? Once again, one of these magical media coincidences that happens. And if you point out the timing, you're called a conspiracy theorist. Literally hours prior to the UN High Court's ruling of plausible genocide against Israel on January 26, 2024, there's a bombshell revelation simultaneously in the New York Times and Wall Street Journal claiming that UNRWA, the UN Refugee Aid Organization, had so-called, quote, links to Hamas and links to the October 7th attack. So they claim that 12, this was the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal went even further and said 10% of UNRWA was Hamas. 12 people out of an organization of 30,000 supposedly had some role on October 7th. Now, never mind that the premise itself made no sense. It's unclear how an organization of 30,000 people in a besieged, starving population, even prior to October 7th, is supposed to track 30,000 employees' moonlight activities. I guess they're supposed to follow them home with a drone. It never really made any sense. But you just needed to have UNRWA and Hamas in the headline as much as possible. So what happens? Every major country, every Western country that funds UNRWA pulls their funding overnight. Now, all but one slowly start to go back to funding it because the story falls apart. Chris Van Hollen, the senator and ally of Biden, says the story's bullshit within weeks. We know that based on subsequent emails that the Wall Street Journal never actually saw any proof. They just published it. Max Tani at Semaphore published an internal email about that. The New York Times kept that was the major headline that day, both online and in print, over the International Court of Justice's plausible genocide ruling. And of course, it was to shock and to provide PR collateral for the destruction of UNRWA, which was ultimately successful. The U.S. Biden backed this claim. It was a completely absurd claim. They pulled funding from UNRWA because they needed the population to starve and not have medical attention, because their goal was, at the very least, to ethnically cleanse northern Gaza, which they were quite explicit about. So you had this obvious ulterior motive to have this mysterious Israeli intelligence that would seem to appear out of nowhere. By the way, Israel never cooperated with UN investigators, and the case was later shut, and they never found any proof for any of this because Israel refused to work with the UN at all.
I have a suspicion of what happened. And this was my suspicion at the time, was that these were Hamas or other militants that Israel picked up during October 7th and tortured them until they said that they were.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah. I mean, it seemed pretty obvious.
Because Israel, again, Israel audits who works for UNRWA. They have the list of people and they vet them themselves. So the whole premise was ridiculous.
Right. And the fact that they had definitive proof that the U.S. government put their eyes on and then affirmed based on that, but no one ever published, no one ever said what it was.
No one ever saw any evidence.
And no one in the media ever saw any evidence. It seems very obvious that was
Yeah, and they did that on a few occasions. They would torture people to say all kinds of whatever they needed for their public relations at that particular moment. And what was obvious, so on October 13th, right, Israel has their evacuation order of northern Gaza, effectively an ethnic cleansing order of all of northern Gaza. And then everything around that then suddenly becomes Hamas, namely the Al-Shifa Hospital, which is the primary medical center in all of northern Gaza, in Gaza City. It's the place you can go to get really any advanced medical care. And then they start saying in late October, actually, this is a Hamas command and control center. They publish a 3D render video that's the most absurd thing you've ever seen. It's got 3 layers, all these bad guys walking around with AK-47s and Hamas flags everywhere. And it looks like a Bond villain layer. It's the most ridiculous thing you've ever seen in your life. And you say, wow, that's pretty extraordinary that a hospital this size with tens of thousands of volunteers over the past 20 years could mysteriously be a Hamas layer without any evidence whatsoever at all. And they had called Al-Shifa Hospital the weeks prior, telling them to evacuate and saying, we're going to assault the hospital if you don't leave. And the media largely buys this. It presents Israel's claim as serious, as not as self-serving. And of course, the only counter argument they use or counter claim they use is not the medical professionals who had worked there. It's not Ken Roth, the former Human Rights Watch leader, who, these kind of liberal bourgeois authorities who all criticize this. It's Hamas denies the allegation. So then that becomes, by default, of course, Israel's always going to win that propaganda battle. And you see this over and over again. And what do? They shell, they raid, they go in. And of course, there's no Hamas fighters there because there never was, because it's a totally made up thing. The Washington Post, to their credit, debunks this, in December of 2023, debunks the command and control center claim. The New York Times, which had invested so much journalistic credibility into it, tries to put lipstick on the pig in February of 2024 by claiming they got new mysterious Israeli intelligence and had found some chamber that was vaguely adjacent to, but did not open or have any entrances into the actual hospital or hospital complex itself. But the headline still said how Hamas uses hospitals, et cetera, et cetera. And so the goal is to sort of just say Hamas over and over again and to delegitimize the civic functions of Gaza, which were run by a combination of Hamas affiliated by virtue of who runs Gaza, but not it's like the Gaza Health Ministry, which we can also get into, but also, of course, the United Nations. And they've been attempting to delegitimize the United Nations, as we mentioned, for a very long time, and just vaguely linking them to October 7th or whatever was the way they did it, despite the fact that, again, the story just fell apart and the New York Times just stopped talking about it. So they have this time and time again, the New York Times, which we distinguish in the book as being categorically worse than, say, a Washington Post or even a CNN. Like, the New York Times is uniquely sinister in that they provide legitimacy to every single lurid, self-serving intelligence laundering operation, whether it be Al-Shifa, whether it be UNRWA, whether it be, again, we can sort of name it. There's about half a dozen or so major interventions they have where right when public anger is growing and there's a real movement to try to put pressure to end the genocide, suddenly they come along with some new mysterious Israeli intelligence that no one else has access to. And it's a trend you see over and over and over again.
I wanted to ask about a particular Al-Shifa slanderer, liar, however you want to say it, Jake Tapper.
Yes.
Because Jake Tapper, I remember distinctly, was everywhere during the major phases of the war against Gaza. Not only Tapper, but Dana Bash, Morning Joe, that whole team there. I was curious, what were the specifics of how they dealt with this narrative? What specifically did they do to sell the genocide that may have been distinct from the methods that you're talking about the New York Times and the Washington Post? Was it specifically the way they expressed bloodlust? Was it just a more conversational tone? I mean, what was it?
So Jake Tapper was very high leverage in promoting the human shield. So the book is organized around what I call modes of rationalization, which is functionally liberals having to rationalize why they supported bombing the horrific images coming across their social media timeline. And one of those modes was, especially after a few weeks, you can't really defend it on first principles, right? People stop defending the genocide on first principles very early. They kind of move on to putting it into the realm of non sequitur or shifting the burden to Hamas. So you have this idea of human shields. Jake Tapper has several different segments where he sort of smugly talks about, Hamas has a strategy of using human shields. Now, what's important to understand is that in international humanitarian law or human rights organizations, none of them support the definition of human shields used by American media, whether it's David Leonhardt or the editorial board of the New York Times and Washington Post or Jake Tapper, which is a guerrilla military in proximity to civilians. That is not what the term means. It means at gunpoint, you force a civilian to protect you from enemy fire or to go clear out landmines or something like that. It's not, you're simply in the area of civilians or military infrastructure or military actors are in the proximity of other civilians. Again, if that were true, then the Mossad headquarters being underground in Tel Aviv, downtown Tel Aviv would be a sort of case number one example. So as the body count increases and begins to rise, Jake Tapper continually runs segments about how Hamas's strategy is to actually use human shields. And so therefore you can offset the moral burden from these horrific images, not on the people actually doing it or the entities or organizations or political entities doing it, but it's actually Hamas's nihilistic strategy. And this, of course, follows from the idea that they hide in hospitals and hide in mosques. Again, none of this is true. Not on any systemic level is there any evidence that any of that is true, because, of course, you can't have any popular support as a guerrilla military if you're hiding in hospitals. It's absurd on its face. because they wanted to create this image that they're a kind of exogenous or alien actor who's had them all captive. And we cannot overemphasize how much this term was used, especially in the first few months. So in the first year, CNN uses it 438 times. MSNBC uses it 450 times. And they used it zero in reference to Israel, despite the fact that we know there are several reports, one of which was featured in the Washington Post, of human rights groups having documented evidence of Israel actually using human shields as the term is understood. They would take 80-year-old Palestinians in Gaza, they would blindfold them and have them walk in front of them to protect them from enemy fire or ambush. They would routinely use teenagers to clear out rooms, etc. So we have documented evidence after documented evidence of Israel actually using human shields as the term is understood. But nevertheless, this was used in the New York Times 150 times in the first year, 0 for Palestinians, 56 in the Washington Post, and only 5 in reference to Palestinian narratives, which is to say, so insofar as Israel does it. And this was a complete media concoction. It is not a narrative or a definition of human shields that's supported by any human rights organization, right? Human rights organizations that everyone was referencing 2 years prior when Russia invaded Ukraine suddenly became sidelined and trivialized. And people just invented this ad hoc definition of human shields, which was pure Zionist propaganda. It came directly from the ADL, from the Institute for Near East Policy, from all these kind of spooky think tanks that had no basis in international humanitarian law and didn't really matter. It sort of just needed to feel vaguely true because we had to hand wave away the carnage coming across our timelines.
And because the thing that they're actually mad about is not the practice of human shielding, as you note, as defined in international humanitarian law, it is the very nature of guerrilla struggle itself.
Correct.
Like what they are frustrated with is the thing that that colonists are always frustrated with, which is the fact that their enemy has indigenous support, is of the people.
And swims among the people, as Mao would say. And you saw this also, because again, the U.S. used the same excuse during Vietnam. They routinely would launder these human shield stories when they would destroy a village. They did it in the Philippines in 1898. This is where the term was first used. Because again, if they don't dress in fatigues and go out in the middle of the desert with the big Wile E. Coyote sign saying bomb here, that's somehow not playing fair. Now, of course, the hypocrisy and the absurdity of this was put on full display when the U.S. evacuated its military bases prior to attacking Iran. And they put military troops in hotels, in civilian hotels in Bahrain and UAE and Saudi Arabia. And they put a lot of the military functions inside of these office spaces, like clearly in civilian infrastructure. So, and this is not a country that's indigenous to the area. This is the most powerful military in the history of the world. And they still employ these kind of quasi-guerrilla tactics, but not a single mention from Jake Tapper or from the Washington Post or the New York Times pointing out how this is using their definition, textbook human shielding.
Totally. And it's also, I think, related to the aid story as well, because what they need to do as the colonial power, right, is to inflict their pain on the civilian population, to sever the guerrillas away from their support base. This is like classic.
It's textbook collective punishment. It's textbook siege warfare. It's just
it's
medieval siege warfare with a suit and tie.
And that's what they have to do. And it's a strategy that goes back, yes, to Vietnam, yes, certainly to the Philippines, where they are kind of pioneering the concentration camp, but all the way back to the Indian Wars of trying to cut out the popular support base by isolating whole communities from access to food and sustenance, just try and starve out the guerrillas, because that's the only effective, and I hate to use that word, but it is the only effective strategy for waging that kind of counterinsurgency as warfare. And I think it's important to say, because the hypocrisy point is a correct one, but the where does it come from story, I think it is just so important to recognize that this is colonialism. This is colonial war. And this is why, magazines like The Atlantic have to run a bajillion pieces saying oh, now, the youth are all obsessed with settler colonialism, or calling Israel a colonial state or whatever, as if that's
literally what they call themselves.
Right. As if this is woke, 90s mumbo jumbo, as opposed to just an age-old story.
Yeah, they ran those, and you would show them headlines from the New York Times saying Zionist settlers, Zionist colonialists. And it's that's what they called themselves. They're still called settlers. That's what that's their self-identified term. Yeah. I mean, again, everything had to be... The big thing a lot of Zionist propagandists, I think, really, especially the more sophisticated kind at The Atlantic, realized very early on is that there was this anti-racist, anti-colonial narrative that emerged, maybe we'll call it woke one, where people were aware of these, and then you could easily graft that onto this particular so-called conflict, because it does graft onto it, and it does for a very specific reason. Now, there are obviously differences, but they would rush out these stories at The Atlantic and New York Times and go, no, this is different than Jim Crow and apartheid. No, it's not. No, it's not.
So I wanted to ask about the US media more broadly, right? Because we hear all the time from liberals about the virtues of the US system. We have a quote unquote free press, right? Unlike the so-called authoritarian countries that have state-controlled media. But in practice, and this is part of what we've been talking about and your work demonstrates, our mainstream free press doesn't really play all that different of a role, or maybe it does play a different role, but not in a way that is, in the interests of liberty and freedom of information and anti-ideological or whatever. So I'm curious, like, what role you think the private press plays, or another way of asking that is, where do you see the private structure or the profit motive coming in as shaping some of the ideology that is being churned out by some of these institutions, CNN, New York Times, MSNBC, et cetera?
Yeah, because obviously I think ostensibly independent or neutral media is obviously going to be more powerful. Like when you look at somewhat schlocky state media, like say in our Russia Today, it's like, it's 100% just the Russia line. So it's not, people kind of roll their eyes and go, okay, well that's, that may be interesting, but I know what I'm getting fed. And historically, the way I think the US press has worked is that it's 90% basically the state line. And then they do 10% to kind of give you a sense of independence. And they'll point to that 10%, aggressively point to that 10% when you point out that in the aggregate, their coverage is de facto state media, even if these terms are even that useful, right? Because obviously the class interest of those who run and own media is not going to be some kind of organic representation of the market. And there's so much ideological disciplining. Again, did Comcast intervene in MSNBC's October 7th coverage because of ratings? No. Clearly there are ideological precepts that all corporate media support, and they're heavily disciplined through various mechanisms. And some are just committed Zionist ideologues, like say Sherry Redstone, who ran CBS, who sold it to the Ellisons so she could go start a pro-Israel propaganda media company or join a pro-Israel propaganda media company. And she intervened repeatedly in 60 Minutes' coverage to make it more pro-Israel. So what's the, is that a function of profit motive? No, clearly she doesn't really care about profit motive. I mean, she bought up this totally schlocky documentary at, I think, Sundance or one of these film festivals that was about how the war has impacted children, and 100% of the coverage is Israeli children. And she aired it on MTV and Paramount, like at her explicit direction. Do I think she did that because these things garner ratings? Like, obviously not. And then, of course, you have, I don't think Comcast corporate or really even CNN have any necessarily ideological commitments to Zionism, but they certainly have commitments to the power structure, to these kind of broad Western chauvinist ideological parameters and the U.S. security state. And then I think as you get closer to the election, a lot of the shilling and a lot of the lies and deflection are mostly motivated by partisan loyalty and partisanship. And that becomes its own force. So it's a combination of just ideologically motivated pro-Israel media owners, corporate conservatism in general, and I think a fear of, Trump 2.0, which of course it was the opposite issue. Had they actually pressured Biden to end this, then I think it would have been much better for that particular partisan reason. But everyone just kind of resigned themselves and said, well, Biden's doing a genocide. We all have to kind of suck it up and deal with it.
And part of the way that they did that, which you cover, is by laundering the kind of like quote unquote Biden's frustrations with Israel to try and get in an implicit criticism of Israel that had no bearing on actual policy outcomes, didn't affect the fact that we continue to supply Israel with arms and aids and diplomatic cover and political support and in their starvation regime, et cetera, and their bombing campaigns. But to just have, and I think this is actually maybe even one way too, that the nominally independent media, corporate media, privatized media can function even more effectively ideologically than a state media, because they can do things like saying, well, we have inside sources, we have leaks that actually Biden is really pissed at Netanyahu. And the end result is a kind of credibility attached to that. And it can allow the US, Israel to play good cop, bad cop, where Netanyahu gets to be the villain, which is what his domestic audience wants. Right. And Biden gets to be the kind of frustrated, good-hearted guy to appeal to his audience.
Yeah, the frustrated, angry, helpless Biden trope was probably, along with human shields, the mode of rationalization most effective at numbing liberal outrage and redirecting liberal outrage into non sequiturs. And we document that extensively. I mean, it was a trope over and over and over again. I could read you off some of the choice headlines. November of 2023, NBC News, the gap between Biden administration and Netanyahu government over Gaza's future is widening. Ooh, it's widening. CNN, December of 2023, unprecedented tensions between White House and Netanyahu as Biden feels political price for standing with Israel. Axios, our friend Barak Ravid. January of 2024, Biden running out of patience with Bibi as Gaza war hits 100 days. Washington Post, February of 2024, Biden moving closer than ever to breach with Netanyahu over war in Gaza. So you have this asymptotic break that is always about to happen that never happens. And the degree to which the illusion of distance and these, again, the parallel helpless Biden stories where he, even if he wanted to, he couldn't really stop Israel because the largest empire in the history of the world was being controlled by a country the size of New Jersey through forces that are never quite clear. That moved it into the realm of non sequitur, which was the goal of these. And 94% of these stories are sourced by anonymous Biden aides, because clearly they're painting that narrative to not only distance Biden from it, but also they want to work in politics in 5, 6, 7, 10 years. And they know this was a genocide, and they knew it was deeply unpopular. So they had to create the illusion of distance where none in fact existed. And you would think that after, we count literally dozens of these, you would think after the 50 or 60th version of the story, an editor would say, well, wait a second. And now it's August of 2024. He's been frustrated for seemingly almost a year, for 9 months. What is he doing in reality? What policy is being changed? And nothing ever changed. We compare it to a sketch versus a plot. It's sort of the same shtick over and over again with no escalation, no beat changes, no policy changes. So he's constantly frustrated and asymptotically about to break with Netanyahu, but never does. And this obviously exists to buy time, and it mostly works. Along with the fake ceasefire negotiations and the redefinition of ceasefire, which we can get into, it mostly buys them time. It gets liberals off their backs and creates the illusion of distance where there in fact was none.
I'm so glad you brought up Barak Ravid. Like, when you brought up RT, I thought about what specifically I see, the people I see interviewed on RT and other state media organizations. There is usually this attempt to launder opinions through third parties, through proxies which are supportive of the viewpoints of the state.
Right.
But they take care not to directly say, this is the spokesman for the Russian government saying this to me. Whereas in the American media, not only do you have someone like Barak Ravid doing all these scoops, who was a reservist up until 2 years ago. He was doing these protests where he wasn't going to show up for service because he was still very much in the IDF structure. You have people like Ronan Bergman, who was in Unit 8200, who is now just the correspondent for the New York Times on all things Israel. And you have the IDF spokespeople being the direct conduit on all these different American media channels over and over and over again. Is there any equivalent to this anywhere else? I mean, why did the American media think that they did not have to go through different parties? Why did it think that it was acceptable just to go straight to the source?
Well, I mean, in many ways they did. I mean, you would go through these think tanks like WINAP and others who are just basically, or Foundation for Defense of Democracies, which is just an Israeli, military cutout. They're ostensibly American, funded by Americans, but their line is just pro-Israel and pro-Likud, to be honest. And then they would, CNN just would constantly have on Israeli spokesmen, especially within the first few weeks and then first few months. And again, I think it's what's important to understand is that, and we had every sources that told us this, is that there wasn't a sense that in the newsroom, especially in October 8th and 9th, when these decisions were made, that there was going to be any kind of both sidesing this, that this was an existential civilizational attack, again, 1 billion 9/11s to the power of 15 9/11s. And this was a civilization versus the Islamic sort of undifferentiated Asiatic hordes, and that we were going to basically be on their side. Now, there would be chiding and criticism around some of the excesses, right? Have too many Palestinians died is always the kind of one pseudo-adversarial question you get, with the implication being is that there's some acceptable amount of dead Palestinians, but no one ever tells you what that number is. That was just the framing. And the framing was it was kind of a 9/11 event, and it was all going to be indexed as this war on terror thing. There was no sense that there was another side. Not really. And so that became the narrative that was intelligible, that was getting quickly digested from top down. Again, Mark Thompson on October 26th, the head of CNN, sends a memo explicitly saying that if you mention Palestinian deaths ever, if you mention any war crimes towards Palestinians or anything that affects Palestinians, you have to bracket it. You have to begin by talking about the death count of October 7th. You editorially cannot, you always have to start the clock on October 7th. Now, of course, there's no corollary to that. Every time you mention the deaths on October 7th, you have to mention the 400 Palestinians who were killed from January 1st to October 6th of 2023, or the 40 children that were killed prior to October 7th in 2023, or of course the 1,500 who were killed during Protective Edge in 2014, or the 523 children who were killed. That doesn't count. That's terrorism apologia. But whenever you mention anything that happens to Palestinians, you always have to frame it as defensive, and you have to start the clock on October 7th. And that functionally creates a narrative of just perpetual defense. And Jake Tapper did this. Jake Tapper did this really snarky, smug, where he talks about the ceasefire crowd. He kind of mocks. And he says, well, what did they expect Israel to do after they killed 1,200 of their own people? And it's like, well, what did Israel expect Palestinians to do when they displaced them and put them into the world's largest concentration camp and killed hundreds of people? I mean, we could do this all day. Now, if anyone ever said that, they would be fired on the spot. But Tapper can kind of do this glib, sort of savvier than thou dismissal of the horrific carnage coming out by saying, well, that's to be predicted, as if this kind of banal descriptive statement is obviously a backdoor normative statement endorsing the death, because supposedly Hamas is supposed to predict and be scared of the genocidal entity that is. And this is like 3 months into it. The death count's already 20,000 or 30,000 at this point. And that level of callousness and that level of faux savvy dismissal of Palestinian humanity is just, again, it's routine and not punished at all.
I remember you're talking about the both sizing thing. I remember in October 2023, there was this kind of desperate mood among people I know, like, why isn't anybody interviewing any of the Hamas representatives anywhere? You could see the desperation from those Hamas representatives because on their Telegram channel, they published the phone numbers of their English-speaking representatives begging for some journalists to contact them and get their opinion out there.
That's terrorism apologia. They're supposed to be a faceless Islamic horde. They're not supposed to have any secular grievances.
Something that has been different to me about the coverage about Gaza and about Iran right now is that Araghchi, the current Iranian foreign minister, other foreign ministry spokespeople, Iranian politicians and officials, there's still a disparity. But there seems to be much more of an attempt to get the Iranian perspective on things to an American audience, even if it is of a hostile attitude. Is that something that you're noticing? Are there other differences and distinctions that you've noticed about coverage of the war with Iran so far in contrast with Gaza?
Yeah, I mean, that's one of them. I think a lot of it is maybe just there isn't that inciting incident of them being attacked. Again, there was not really an even justification for attacking Iran. They tried to do the 80 billion protesters were killed thing, but no one really kind of bought that. And then so there was no 9/11 event to kind of have that traumatic and psychological element to it.
No, the preemptive war thing twice in 2 years. Yeah.
Plus, Iran is, of course, a state in the sense that they may be indexed as a terror state or whatever, but they're a state. Every government official has 5 PhDs and they can sort of speak for themselves. And obviously a lot of them, if not all of them, speak English. Whereas, again, Hamas is sort of seen as this grimy ISIS-like entity. And so there was always going to be asymmetry there with how it was covered. Now, that doesn't stop them from trying to dehumanize and to reduce them into terrorist cartoons. But I think it's just much harder functionally. And also, I think the appetite for the war on Iran, because it was Trump doing it, was not as bipartisan. I don't think one can overemphasize the degree to which the fact that the genocide, especially in the first year, was bipartisan, really made any other narrative impossible. That when the worst place to be in the world is on the business end of a bipartisan consensus in Washington. And the genocide was bipartisan. And the war in Iran kind of was. And obviously Schumer supported it, but couldn't say so explicitly. Jeffrey supported it, but couldn't say so explicitly. But it was a 94 to, I think, 5% issue with Democrats. So I think it was a combination of fatigue, a combination of partisanship, and also just the fact that Iran, whether they want it to be or not, is a state in the kind of traditional sense.
And it's interesting too, because you saw during the genocide that for one reason or another, the election, whatever, the Democrats sought to build popular legitimacy behind it. They wanted to be viewed as doing the right thing.
Yes.
And they cared about that. They cared about popular opinion. And I think that had a profound impact on how they messaged and how the media picked up and ran with it. And we don't really see that from the White House. No. They prefer to just kind of live in their cone of ignorance where all the polls are cucked and it doesn't actually matter. But still, nevertheless, there are some similarities, right? You still have fucking Barack Ravid going out and in the way that he was reporting on frustrations from the White House or whatever, every Friday, we get, we're on the verge of a breakthrough in negotiations. The negotiations are going really well. And, maybe the audience is different. Maybe it's bond traders or whoever, you know what I mean?
They still sort of run through the motions. I mean, I remember when he first did his tweet and his Truth Social announcement about how he was going to defend protesters. And liberal media, and they did this with Venezuela as well, lowercase L liberal media, not the Rush Limbaugh boogeyman, but center-left liberal establishment media would run and kind of do this human rights laundering for Trump pro bono, like not even at his prompting or even sourced by the White House. They did this with, Maduro kidnapping, saying the Ghost Fleet coverage was always sensationalist and decontextualized. They did it with the protest crackdown in Iran. And that was the first time Trump had ever feigned that he cared about human rights. Literally, in almost 5 years of being president, he had never once claimed any human rights argument for a war ever. He throws out some half-ass Truth Social post, and every media organization says, Trump may attack because of the crackdown on protesters. And it's like, who believes that? I mean, that's the most absurd thing you've ever. So they voluntarily, because of the nature of liberal imperialism, right, which is a machine that churns on with or without Trump, needs to keep going. And they would liberal wash for him. They did it with Venezuela. They did it with, all the Ghost Fleet nonsense. They did it with the supposed human rights pretext for the bombing of Iran. And they did it to a great extent with the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation. You would get some critical reporting around that here and there, but a lot of it was mostly just repeating the supposed humanitarian aims of their starvation regime. So liberal imperialism can exist in parallel with this fascistic indifference to the pretense of human rights because it has to keep going. Trump is going to be gone in 3 years, one hopes, but the liberal imperialist kind of logic and moral order of the State Department and the U.S. military and the think tank world has to keep churning on. This is like when at the peak of the genocide, when Tony Blinken would get on social media and start talking about human rights in China. And it's like this system of moral superiority and faux human rights just has to keep going regardless of what's going on in Gaza or Lebanon. So, it's an institution that's too big to fail and is much bigger than Trump.
Yeah. So one piece of this story that was very central and hasn't yet come up in our conversation, but it was something that I was following very closely for both professional and political reasons, is the ecosystem around the anti-Semitism smear. And on college campuses in particular, where a lot of the anti-genocide organizing was taking place from the fall of 2023 throughout all of 2024. And there were a lot of different actors involved, the Zionist lobby groups, university administrations, politicians. But a key piece of this system is this quasi-libidinal obsession that elite media has with the campus. And I'm curious what you make of that and how you think it served to feed into the repression that we saw across the country and to deflect attention away from the genocide itself.
So I spent a whole chapter 8, going into the manufactured anti-Semitism crisis on campus. Certainly, they do have a disproportionate obsession with college campuses, but I don't actually think it's unjustified. I think it actually is completely justified because inherently it's going to be more idealistic, less prone to tattling to the manager, right? The Zionist crybaby lobby relies heavily on getting people fired. And people in university, you just can't quite do that as much. And of course, combine the fact that they're going to be just generally more progressive, more left-wing, and they can create media sensations or spectacles by shutting down university campuses. And very quickly, I think they realized that to the extent to which there was going to be a protest movement, it was going to be on campuses. And of course, they had the pro-Palestine infrastructure at a lot of these organizations already. And the crackdown on that needed to have a liberal narrative like everything else. So unlike previous crackdowns on campus protests during Vietnam, where it was ostensibly under the guise of authoritarianism or patriotism, this was supposedly to fight a form of racism. So you had these pre-existing rules and regulations on the campus, as well as federal law about discrimination that you could easily turnkey and weaponize against campus protesters by completely flattening Zionist and Jewish identities, which they very quickly did to great effect. First, you had these show trials with the university presidents who were brought up before Congress, and then they were told, do you denounce the term globalize the Intifada? And they'd say, well, no, because that means something different to everyone. And of course, we oppose, and it's a violation of school policy to intimidate people based on religion or ethnicity or race. But globalize the Intifada is just an Arabic word. And then the headline becomes, university presidents refuse to denounce call to genocide Jewish students. And it's like, what? So you're already assuming that there was some call. Of course, there never was. And that's when you realize, we're going to do the kind of Corbyn playbook where there's this all smoke and no fire. Everything's very meta. It's reporting on reporting. It's reporting on reporting on reporting. Do you denounce this person who refuses to denounce this? And then you look back and you can't even remember what we're talking about. And then eventually, of course, once the campus protests reached their peak in spring of 2024, you repeatedly had this obsession with what I call the very serious anti-Semitism trend piece, which were almost all spoon-fed by groups like the ADL, Camera, and these other pro-Israel crybaby organizations that operate on campuses, where they would take either self-reporting or they would take genuine anti-Semitic incidents that happened in other campuses thousands of miles away, and they would kind of string them together into this vague, like, proto-pogrom narrative, where you felt like we were always on the precipice of some Nazi crackdown on Jewish students. And then you read the details, and it's either, again, self-reporting, anecdotal, or the vast majority of the time, it's explicit Zionist activity being framed as being attacked because they're Jewish. I'll give you one example here in Chicago, in DePaul University. 2 students who were active members of the IDF were recruiting for the IDF on campus and doing the, like, debate me liberal thing where they were on the corner every day, defending the IDF, defending Israel, waving Israeli flags. And then 2 guys take it upon themselves to punch him in the face. And then the headline is 2 Jewish students attacked in anti-Semitic incidents. Now, I think it's very clearly they were attacking because they were engaging in promoting a genocidal military. I don't know. Again, it would be the world's biggest coincidence if they were attacked purely because of their religious or ethnic status, and it just so happened to be there. I mean, so you saw this over and over and over again at Columbia University. You would say counter-protesters would come target the anti-genocide protesters. They would barricade them in a library, and it says Jewish students barricaded. And then you'd read the fine print, and you say, no, they were waving Israeli flags and, like, promoting Israel. And there's so many different examples of this flattening and conflation. And you would always look up the person who was their main source, and it's always, yeah, they work for the Israeli Foundation for the Liquidation of Arabs. And then they would pass them off as this, like, small beans Jewish student, quote unquote Jewish student. And it created a completely alternate universe where there was a genuine sense there was pogroms going on university campuses. When you actually look at the details, when you look at what's being reported on, it's extremely thin. It's very solipsistic. I mean, there's an opening vignette to one early New York Times article from November of 2023 where a Jewish student at Columbia sees a billboard that says, Gaza is a concentration camp. And and he talks about how much this made him feel unsafe. And it's like, what the fuck are you talking about? That is not what anti-Semitism means. Like, the word has a definition, but it just became about this, again, very mopey. All these articles, these kind of trend pieces would have a picture of us, one of these pro-Israel students sitting in a chair, like alienated in a room, looking out the window. They always have this photo and the light hits him just so. And it's like to create this narrative that they were under siege. And you would think, again, reading these, and we quantitatively show how, so even when they do the studies, right, because these universities get bullied into doing these anti-Semitism studies to show the sort of surge of anti-Semitism on campus, even using a lot of the ADL's own cooked up numbers, it's always on par with Islamophobia. The Harvard study in particular shows it's roughly 50-50 in terms of perceptions of safety, in terms of incidences. And yet anti-Semitism is covered 15, 20, 30 times more based on our data. I mean, it's not even remotely close in terms of the coverage. And in fact, it's so unclose. I'm going to read some of those data points right now if you'll indulge me, because I think it's an important point. This is the mention of Islamophobia or anti-Semitism in headlines as it relates to campuses. In total, there were 394 headlines that mentioned anti-Semitism and only 34 that mentioned Islamophobia. Only 22 mentioned both, because sometimes liberals would box check. New York Times was 82-8, anti-Semitism versus Islamophobia. Washington Post was 54-5. AP was 75-4. Politico was 29-2. So it's almost exclusively a 10-1 ratio. And meanwhile, on cable news, it was distorted altogether. It was like 450 to just a handful. And so even if you accept the premise that there's this, rise of anti-Semitism, you have to accept a corollary premise that there's a rise in Islamophobia, because we have equal documented number of incidences, even not using the ADL's own cooked up numbers. And yet the ratio is almost always 10-1. And then, of course, you have the attacks at UCLA in May of 2024, when the Zionist vigilantes took batons and started attacking pro-Palestine protesters completely unprovoked. And you have the chemical attacks in late 2023 in Columbia University. And that is never, ever, ever framed as anti-Muslim or anti-Arab racism. Never. It's never put in these sectarian terms. So when Zionist hooligans attacked pro-Palestine students or Palestinians, it's not framed as Islamophobic or ethnic hatred, but every single counter-protest and every single attack and every single anything targeted towards overtly pro-Israel students was always framed in the most sectarian way possible.
Yeah. And what you're naming is the very racist logic about who gets access to safety. And I work in this field. I work at Palestine Legal, and I deal with a lot of these issues on campuses. And routinely, what I see is a situation in which it is the quote unquote safety of Jewish students, and it's really like a safety from ideas that make them uncomfortable, versus the speech rights of Arab Muslims and Palestinians. That Arab Muslims and Palestinians are not really treated as the type of community members within the system of the university that actually get access to safety. They at most get the right to express themselves. And that right is cabined by how much they are infringing on the sense of safety held by Jewish students who disagree with them politically. And there is this illusion of universalism or equality, of we're trying to grapple with the tough issues that just sits right on top of an extremely racialized logic. And I just have to shout out Sam Catlin had a really excellent piece on this a couple of years ago in Parapraxis. I think it's called something like "The Campus Does Not Exist," which we can drop in the show notes. But it's just an immensely frustrating thing to have to try and argue against and deal with.
Yeah, and you read these stories, and again, the level of just solipsism and believing that the mere existence of Arabs or Palestinians is somehow like offensive to you, or correctly describing what Israel does is somehow a form of racism. And this is really central to this idea of quantum Zionism. Like Zionism is simultaneously a kind of personal feeling and an abstraction and a kind of warm and fuzzy thing you did in your childhood or you visited in your childhood. But it's also a military, state with F-22s that is murdering toddlers. And anytime you would criticize the former, the superposition would collapse and they would become small beans Jewish identity. And like this constant, it was sort of whatever you needed it to be at that time. So if Zionism is a cultural or ethnic or religious identity, then it becomes, and this is the ADL will even tell you this, it becomes impossible to meaningfully critique this particular nation state and its imperial patrons' primary relationship with them. And so, again, I mean, the hysteria surrounding this coverage was completely, I'm sure y'all visited some of these campus sites as I did, was completely 180 degrees from what you saw when you actually showed up. Again, it was not sectarian. It was not exclusionary. It was not a hotbed of anti-Semitism. But again, the ADL sends out these panicked emails every morning with a little alarm emoji, and anyone who gives someone the side eye is an anti-Semitic incident.
I wanted to close out by talking about another popular redefinition, which we've been kind of circling around, but I wanted to address directly. When people who were back in Gaza were talking about a ceasefire, there was a general understanding of what a ceasefire was.
Correct.
Right? And suddenly, over the course of 2024, the definition of what a ceasefire was not only got redefined by both Israel and the United States government, but also by the media as to what that even was.
Right.
And I feel like I see the reverberations of what the media helped do in all of these different ceasefire talks that are happening right now in regards to Iran and with Lebanon. As we were recording this, there was a 45-day extension to the ceasefire, even though there absolutely seems to be no movement on that on the ground whatsoever. Can you talk about what that shift was like? And do you fear that the reverberations of that are going to continue way past this? Not even in terms of what Israel or America is doing, but other countries taking after that?
Yeah. So again, on October 13th, Tony Blinken issues a memo banning anyone at the State Department and the White House in general from using the C word, using the word ceasefire, because everybody knew what it meant. Again, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, Oxfam, Doctors Without Borders all called for a ceasefire because it had a very specific and clear precedent, which is the U.S. calls Israel and says, "You're done. Stop bombing Gaza." Because it has that unilateral and dispositive authority whenever it wants. Everybody knows that. And the White House was very clearly opposing a ceasefire, very explicitly. But they supported a temporary pause, which is effectively saying we can pause for doing hostage or captive exchanges, and then Israel reserves the right and will invariably and will go back to destroying so-called Hamas, right? The genocide as it turned out to be. Then that got unpopular because the raw nihilism of the violence, the clear insanity of it, the massive carnage, the children carrying around their siblings in plastic bags became really, really bad public relations. And then on the eve of the Michigan primary in early March 2024, they're about to be embarrassed by the uncommitted movement, which was gaining steam and becoming used as a kind of vehicle to have objection against what was then a kind of fait accompli Biden nominee. So then very cleverly, in late February of 2024, they say, "Oh, we support a ceasefire." And then you see people start celebrating. Look, Biden supports a ceasefire. And you say, well, wait a second. What's his definition of ceasefire? Oh, his definition of ceasefire is Hamas surrenders. Well, okay. In 5,000 years of warfare, up until February of 2024, the word ceasefire means both parties cease firing and they come to some political solution. It doesn't mean you win the war. It doesn't mean you get full capitulation from one side. That's not what the word means. But then that's what the word meant. It just what their assertion. And they would say this. They'd say, we need a ceasefire and we need to begin to build Gaza with Hamas no longer in power. Well, wait a second. You skipped a step there. Are they supposed to just give their weapons over via magic? And it never made any sense. And anyone who paid attention to it never made any sense. And yet no one ever talked about the fact that there was this glaring contradiction in this definition. And the only person who ever brought it up was Barak Ravid. And he painted it as a good thing. He said it was, quote, constructive ambiguity, which is a way of saying that let's just say we support a ceasefire so we can provide public relations cover for dragging this on for months, which is, of course, what happened. So when I wrote for The Nation in March of 2024 that this was a completely illogical and nonsensical redefinition of ceasefire and predicted that this would just simply buy the White House time to support genocide, I had no unique predictive powers. I just knew what was going on because it was obvious that this was a way to buy time and to continue to militarily support the genocide while acting like you were somehow separate or independent of it, or even better, or a bumbling humanitarian organization standing around on the sidelines with a clipboard trying to convince Israel and Palestine to come to terms. But what the White House meant was, we'd really like a ceasefire, but it has to be entirely on Israel's terms, and we will never cease supporting them militarily until they come to those terms. And they refused to use their only leverage that would have mattered, which is the credible withdrawal in military supplies and weapons. And they repeatedly said that. Again, they were honest about this, but liberals and liberal media saw what they wanted to see. And so you had this completely bizarro, non-existent, theatrical so-called ceasefire talks. And Egyptian mediators later said it in an article in late 2024 that it was all for PR consumption, both within Israel and the US, where there was this fundamental contradiction that no one in our media ever addressed, which is, how are you going to have a ceasefire but then eliminate Hamas through magic? It just did not make sense. And again, they're still holding on to this position. And this late into 2025, this is still the mainstream position, despite the fact that it makes no sense. And the idea that the armed insurgent movement would hand over its weapons and submit itself to an entity that almost everyone now agrees is committing genocide is absurd on its face, because they'll just finish the job without any organized or mechanized opposition. And so that right there was another PR coup. Probably, I would say the redefinition of ceasefire and that fake ceasefire negotiation narrative was really the central lie that held it together from February of 2024 into the end of the presidency for about almost a year. And that's why, again, people were so angry and so frustrated, both inside and outside the United Center, when Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez said that Harris was tirelessly working for a ceasefire. It propped up the central lie. It wasn't just some throwaway line. It was actually pretty damaging because it was implicitly calling all the protesters stupid. Why would you be protesting if he's tirelessly working on a ceasefire? It doesn't make any sense. And I was there at the United Center when she said it. I was like, oh my God, that's not going to play well. And so that central lie was just there to, again, create, just like helpless and Biden, frustrated Biden, was just another mode of theater to get pressure off the White House, despite the fact that no one ever reconciled the obvious contradiction in these claims.
Adam, thank you so much for speaking with us today.
Oh, thank you for having me.